I wasn't the one who asked for the meeting. I want to make that clear before I tell you anything else, because for weeks afterward, my sister told anyone who would listen that I'd arranged the whole thing, that I'd called Walter Hendricks myself and asked him to humiliate her in front of everyone. That's not what happened. What happened is I got a phone call on a Tuesday morning, still in my work clothes, still holding a stack of invoices I hadn't finished processing, and a woman with a clipped professional voice told me my presence was required at the reading of my grandmother's will. I hadn't spoken to my grandmother in 4 months. Not because we were fighting, because nobody in my family thought to tell me she was sick until she wasn't anymore. The lawyer's office was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind of place with creaky floors and a receptionist who still used a paper appointment book. Walter Hendricks had handled my grandmother's affairs for almost 30 years. I remembered him vaguely from when I was a kid. A tall gray man who always smelled like peppermint and carried a leather folder everywhere, like it was an extension of his arm. My parents were already seated when I walked in. My mother had done her hair. That detail bothered me more than it should have. You don't do your hair for your own mother's will reading unless some part of you is expecting to be photographed, or unless some part of you already knows this is a performance. My sister Brittany arrived 12 minutes late, sunglasses pushed up into her blonde hair even though it was overcast outside, scrolling her phone as she sat down beside our parents. She didn't look at me. She never really did. Not since we were teenagers, not since the year everything between us quietly rearranged itself into something colder. "We're still waiting on one more person," Walter said, checking his watch. I assumed it would be my grandmother's neighbor, or maybe her old church friend Dolores, who used to bring her soup every Sunday. Instead, the door opened, and a man I didn't recognize walked in, mid-30s, tired eyes, a jacket that looked slept in. He sat in the chair farthest from all of us, near the window, and didn't say a word. Nobody asked who he was. That should have told me something right there. In families like mine, silence is never accidental. Silence is a decision everyone makes at the same time without discussing it first. Walter opened his folder. "Before I read the will," he said, "your grandmother left a letter. She was very specific that it be read aloud, in this room, before anything else." My mother's hand found my father's on the armrest between them. Brittany finally looked up from her phone. Walter cleared his throat and began to read. "If you're all sitting in this room together, it means I'm gone, and it also means none of you have found the courage to have the conversation I spent the last 2 years of my life trying to start. I'm sorry for that. Some of it is my fault. I let silence become a habit in this family long before any of you were born, and habits like that get passed down whether we mean them to or not." I watched my mother's jaw tighten. "I want to start with an apology to my granddaughter Emily, who is sitting in this room right now, and who has spent her whole life believing she was the version of this family that didn't quite fit. That was never true. But I understand why you believed it, sweetheart, because I watched it happen and I didn't stop it." I felt my face go hot. Every chair in that room seemed to turn 10 degrees in my direction, even though nobody physically moved. Brittany's mouth had gone thin and flat. Walter kept reading, his voice steady, unbothered by the temperature of the room. "When Emily was 9 years old, her father, my son, made a decision that changed the course of this family, and none of you have ever spoken about it honestly. Not at dinner, not at holidays, not even to each other in private, as far as I can tell." My father's hand slid off the armrest. "I didn't know what she meant. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy for me to sit here now and tell you I always suspected something, that I'd always felt some old family wound humming underneath the surface of things. But the truth is simpler and less flattering. I had no idea what my grandmother was about to say. I was just as lost as everyone pretending not to look at me. There is a man in this room who has waited 31 years for someone in this family to tell him the truth. His name is Marcus Doyle. I found him 8 months ago after hiring someone to do what none of you were willing to do. I am not going to explain everything in this letter, because some things deserve to be said out loud by the people who lived them, not read from a page by a lawyer. But I will say this much. Marcus is Emily's older half-brother, and her father has known about him since before Emily was born. The room didn't gasp. It didn't erupt. That's not how real families work, no matter what television has taught you to expect. What actually happened was worse than a gasp. What actually happened was silence so complete I could hear the radiator ticking against the wall. I turned to look at the man by the window, Marcus. He was staring at his hands, jaw working like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. My father hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. His face had the stillness of a man who has spent 3 decades preparing for a moment and still discovers, when it finally arrives, that no amount of preparing was enough. "Dad," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Is that true?" He didn't answer me. He answered my grandmother instead, which is a strange thing to say about a woman who was no longer in the room, but that's what it felt like. He was answering the letter. "She had no right," he said quietly. "She had no right doing this here, like this." Walter, to his credit, didn't stop reading. I think he'd been told exactly what to expect and exactly not to react to it. I know some of you will be angry with me for choosing this method. I thought about it for a long time. I decided that if I told you privately, one at a time, the story would get smaller with every retelling. Someone would soften it. Someone would explain it away. I wanted you all to hear it together at the same time, so nobody could rewrite what was said. My mother finally spoke. "You knew," she said to my father. Not a question. A verdict delivered in 4 words, in front of her daughters, in front of a lawyer, in front of a stranger who might be her stepson. "Not from the beginning," my father said. It wasn't like that." 31 years, my mother said. "How is that not like that?" I looked back at Marcus. He had lifted his head and was watching my father with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself, more than once, in that same family, at that same dinner table. It was the look of someone waiting to be acknowledged by people who had spent their whole life pretending he was theoretical. "I didn't come here for money," Marcus said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "I want to say that now, before anyone assumes it, He stopped, glanced at me, seemed to decide something. "Emily's grandmother found me. I didn't go looking for any of you. I had a life. I had a mother who raised me and never once made me feel like half a person. And I wasn't looking to blow that up by finding a father who clearly didn't want to be found." "Then why come?" Brittany said. It was the first thing she'd said since sitting down, and it came out sharper than the room could hold. "Because your grandmother asked me to," Marcus said, "and because she was the only person from this family who ever called me on my birthday. I want to tell you I felt something noble in that moment. Solidarity, maybe. A sense that I had gained a brother instead of losing a version of my family I'd already stopped believing in. But mostly what I felt was a strange, disorienting grief for the 9-year-old version of myself who used to sit at that dinner table trying to figure out why she never felt fully claimed, why her father's attention always seemed to arrive late and leave early, like a guest reluctant to commit to the evening. Walter set the letter down. "There's more," he said, "but I think we should take a short recess." Nobody moved for a full minute. Brittany finally stood, arms crossed so tightly across her chest that her knuckles had gone pale. "This is insane," she said. "She waited until she was dead to drop this on us? Couldn't she have just told us privately like a normal person?" "Would you have believed her?" I asked. I hadn't planned to say it. It came out before I decided it was worth saying. Brittany looked at me like I'd slapped her. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means every time something inconvenient came up in this family, somebody decided it was easier to pretend it wasn't happening," I said. "I'm just wondering if this would have gone any differently if she'd told us over the phone instead of in a lawyer's office." "Don't," my mother said. Not angry exactly, tired. "Not right now." We took the recess. Walter offered water. Nobody drank it. My father stood by the window, as far from Marcus as the room allowed, and stared out at the parking lot like the answer to something might be written on the asphalt. My mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing, the kind of stillness that comes right before someone decides whether they're going to cry or go numb instead. I walked over to Marcus. It felt strange, approaching a stranger and calling him family in the same motion, but I didn't know what else to do with the 10 feet of carpet between us. "I'm Emily," I said, even though he clearly knew. "I know," he said. "Your grandmother showed me pictures. She talked about you a lot, actually. said you were the only one in the family who still called her every week. That undid something in me I hadn't expected to feel undone. I'd called my grandmother every Sunday for as long as I could remember, mostly out of habit, sometimes out of guilt, sometimes because she was the only person in my family who asked real questions and waited for real answers. I never thought of it as significant. I thought of it as ordinary. "She never told you about me?" I asked. "Before all this?" "She told me you existed," he said. "She didn't tell me much else. I think she wanted to be fair to all of us." When we reconvened, Walter read the rest of the will. It wasn't dramatic in the way I expected. My grandmother had split her estate 3 ways, evenly, between me, Brittany, and Marcus. My father received nothing, which nobody in the room reacted to out loud, though I saw my mother's shoulders drop half an inch, like some private argument inside her had just been settled without her permission. There was a smaller bequest, too, a piece of jewelry, a ring my grandmother had worn every day of my childhood, and it was left to me specifically, with a note. For the granddaughter who never needed to be told she mattered, she simply acted like family without being asked to. Brittany didn't say anything about the ring. She stared at the paper Walter handed her, the one listing her third of the estate, and I watched something complicated move across her face. Relief, maybe, that she hadn't been cut out, tangled up with something closer to shame, that she'd spent the whole reading assuming the worst version of events was happening to her specifically. We didn't leave that office as a repaired family. I want to be honest about that too, because these stories always tempt you toward a neat ending, and life rarely hands you one. My father and I didn't speak again for another 6 weeks. When we finally did, it wasn't an apology, exactly. It was closer to an admission, delivered over coffee he didn't finish, about a woman he'd been involved with before he married my mother, about a son he told himself he'd protect by staying away, about how staying away eventually curdled into something that looked a lot like cowardice, no matter what he called it at the time. "I told myself I was being responsible," he said, "keeping it contained. I didn't understand until much later that containing it just meant hurting more people slowly instead of fewer people all at once." I didn't forgive him that day. I'm not sure forgiveness works the way people describe it in movies, where it arrives in a single conversation and resolves everything permanently. What I did instead was keep talking to him, slowly, on my own terms. The way you'd test weight on a bridge you're not sure will hold you. Marcus and I talk now, most weeks, not because blood obligates us to, I don't think it does, not really, but because we chose to, the way you choose any relationship worth keeping. He came to my apartment for dinner 2 months after the will was read, and we spent 3 hours trading stories about a woman who had, in her own complicated and quietly stubborn way, tried to give both of us something my father never managed to. The truth, spoken plainly, even if it came late, even if it cost her something to say it.
Brittany and I are still working on it. Some weeks that means nothing more than a text about our mother's birthday. Other weeks it means an actual conversation, the kind where neither of us performs for an audience that isn't even there. It's slower than I'd like. Most honest things are. I keep my grandmother's ring in a small box on my dresser. I don't wear it often. I like knowing it's there, though, a reminder that somebody in my family looked at the quiet, overlooked daughter and decided, finally, and on paper, in a room full of people who needed to hear it, that she had never been the one they didn't choose. She had simply been the one they forgot to say it to.